Board. All right. I'm going to share my screen. Good morning. It's good to see you all. You all have probably seen me multiple times at this point. Um, if you don't know who I am, my name is Ezra. I use they, them pronouns, and I have been organizing this conference for the past 5-ish months with, of course, the help of many people on the VPLC team. So thank you for being here today. I guess I had to outdo myself and also present at the conference that I'm running. So here we are this morning, and this is what I'm going to talk about. I have a lot of things that I'd like to cover today. And thank you to those who had already answered the polls that I put up. You do not have to do it now if you don't want to, but that was helpful in terms of making sure I had relevant content in my slides. So thank you for doing that. Okay, and so there are a couple other people slowly trickling into this session, but I'm just going to go ahead and get started with an intro again of who I am. So again, you've seen me a lot. I am the Education Technology and Training Specialist at VPLC. I started back in May. I am currently based out of Rockville, Maryland, so a little bit away from Richmond, Virginia, but still working remotely most time, helping with organizing different educational events at VPLC, and providing support with various trainings. So that's why you've seen me organizing this conference and hosting and all of that good stuff. Just to let you know a little bit about why I am qualified, at least in some aspects, to talk about this topic. I have been involved in LGBTQ plus advocacy for over a decade now. It's something that I've been passionate about since a very young age. It's something that is personal to me as being in that community. And so it's something that I love to do. And in fact, my previous job, I was the director of education and outreach. It's an organization called Free State Justice. They are a legal advocacy nonprofit and actually very similar to VPLC in many ways. The main difference is that they have a focus on representing low-income clients from the LGBTQ plus community in Maryland. And so I had started there as the case manager, actually. And so this is where I will say I am not an attorney. So I will be citing various laws throughout, but I am not an attorney, so I cannot give legal advice. So I got to say that little disclaimer right there off the bat. However, I have worked with attorneys for quite a few years. Again, started out as a case manager. I did intakes with various clients, usually helping them with name changes and gender marker changes. And then ended up kind of expanding to the training and educational aspect. And that's how I kind of ended up doing things like this full time. Absolutely loved it. I still actually am an educational consultant for Free State. I just wanted to expand to do a whole bunch of other things. So that's how I came here. And of course, very important, I own a dog named Mango. He's a 3-year-old Chihuahua mix. He's currently right next to me. I am having him be right next to me in case he decides to try to bark at something out the window. Sincere apologies. If you hear him at any point, I will do my best to stop him. And just so if he does bark and you get mad, just remember he looks cute. There he is right there. So you know, if that helps you, he's a cute dog, just sometimes annoying. All right, so this is what we're going to cover today, just a very basic agenda. And by the way, you can find a copy of these slides if you scroll down. So where you see me in the PowerPoint, if you scroll down a bit, eventually after my bio, I believe you will see a section called handouts. You will see 2 items in there, one of them being these slides. So if it's easier for you to download to actually follow along today, please feel free to do that. So I'm going to start off with some basics of terminology, and I have a little subsection about understanding transgender issues in particular. I usually go a little bit more in depth with that just because a lot of questions usually come from really understanding gender identity and what that means. And then I'm going to get into, kind of explaining a little bit about systemic discrimination, what that looks like when we're talking about the LGBTQ plus community. I'm going to talk over some laws and protections, experiences in the courtroom. We won't actually so the food for thought scenario, that is the other handout that's located in the handout section on here. We're not going to actually go through that word for word. If we had a bunch more time, I would probably do that. But that's something that I just want to share with you so that you can, really think about it, and almost as like an optional homework, if you will, to think about. And then we'll go over just some wrap up best practices, some resources, just some organizations I think you should know and maybe follow for more information. And then we'll get to the Q&A. So you can post any questions you have now, if you'd like, in the Q&A or in the chat boxes. I'm not going to look at that until the end. I'm watching the time over here. So I will make sure that, in less than an hour, I'll be wrapping up, and I'll leave at least 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end. So feel free to post at any point, and I will check those at the end. All right. So now we're going to actually start with the basics. So, before I go to the next slide, that's going to have something that probably is a little bit confusing to those who are not as familiar with these terms. I just want to talk to you a little bit about binaries. So we are, as humans, we're used to these boxes, right? If you're not one thing, then typically you are the other thing. So, you'll sometimes hear people say, oh, boys like these things. So they like, trucks, or girls like the color pink or wearing dresses, black or white. And it's really a way that our brains just allow us to understand the world around us. It's not inherently a bad thing. And I want that to be very clear that it has a, binary opposition. It has a reason. It's a real phenomenon, and it helps us understand and contextualize our day-to-day lives. So, for example, Democrat and Republican. Now, we know that not every single person is just a Democrat or a Republican. There are many other parties that exist as well. But in our brain, to make it a little bit easier to understand, that's usually how we kind of separate it as the two main categories, as a binary. And you can think about that with other things that you see, such as good versus evil, kind of technicalities, yin yang, all of that. But we know in theory, and I know you all know this, that not every girl is obsessed with the color pink or wearing dresses. There's more than just Democrat or Republican. It's way more complicated than that. And so the infographic that's on the next slide is trying to kind of convey that message that everything's a little bit more complicated than just one thing or the other, and that's okay. Now, this is just one example of some fun little infographics that exist out there. So there is one that is just lovingly called the genderbread person. I love that. I love the name. This is the gender unicorn right here, probably the most up-to-date version of this kind of graphic. And again, I start out with this just really to say it's all a lot. There are a lot of things that we're not going to cover today. And there are a lot of things that even I can learn more about. So while I know plenty about this information, I do not know everything, and I only represent a small, portion of the community myself. So the idea of this here is that the categories that you see here, so gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, all, etc., they're all spectrums. Again, it's not necessarily just male and female. You can be anywhere on this spectrum. And so for me, you may have noticed that I put at the beginning that I use they, them pronouns, and I think I said that out loud as well. And so for me, for my gender identity, I always jokingly say that I feel like I'm 60% male and 40% female. And that's because of just my lived experiences that I have and basically how I see myself. And I'll talk a lot about myself throughout, just so I think it's easier to understand if you hear an actual person's experiences. I am an open book, so seriously, you can ask anything. Um, and so we're going to go into these terms a little bit more in detail rather than just showing you this, because again, there's a lot to take in here. So I encourage you to revisit it and think about it. So, kind of breaking down this little unicorn is sex at first. And you'll see it's pointing to a little DNA strand there. And so our sex is assigned at birth. That's usually how we say it is, for example, for me, again, I was assigned female at birth. And essentially that means that when the doctor, took me out of my mom, basically looked at me and said, it's a girl based on organs, my chromosomes, and the hormones that I have in my body. The doctor was wrong, but that's okay. I forgive them. And so just some examples of sexes. So again, binary opposition, we usually are trained to think female and male. And yes, that is the majority of people. The majority of people fall into those two boxes. There's no denying that. But there is about 1% to 2% of people fall into a very big, what I would consider a catch-all umbrella term, intersex. And I know somebody in the polls was curious to hear more about the term intersex. So I will say that I do have an infographic here on the next page. But I just would like to point out that 1% to 2% of people, I know that that percentage sounds quite low, but that's around the same as redheaded people there are, naturally redheaded, not people who dye their hair red, of course. And so that's actually a significant portion of the population. And so that I like to share that because I think that's something that we, don't necessarily think about when we see something like 1% to 2%. Okay. And so I added in this infographic, and apologies, it's probably a little bit hard for you to read right now, but again, download the slides so you can zoom in a little bit more and see it better, and I'll read some of this on here as well. So really, we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about intersex today because there's so much you could talk about within this term, but I just wanted to give you a broad idea of what this means since it was asked. And so really, again, it is somebody who does not fit the stereotypical, or really the typical, chromosomes. It could be chromosomes, sex organs, hormones, all of that. Something is a little bit different than what you typically see in somebody who is assigned male or female at birth. So it could be somebody who has ambiguous reproductive organs of some sort. There are some people who are, born with, for example, mostly female reproductive organs, but turns out they also have testes. That would be an example of an intersex condition. It could be somebody who has abnormal sex chromosomes. So again, typically XX chromosomes are found in people assigned female at birth, and XY are found in typically assigned male at birth. But sometimes there's XXY, XYY. There's a bunch of different variations of that actually. And again, abnormal sex hormones. So it'd be like, for example, somebody who I believe it's called androgen sensitivity syndrome. So that's somebody who is assigned female at birth, but their testosterone levels are incredibly high and not in the normal range for somebody assigned female at birth. So again, 1 in 1,500 births, that's a lot actually. And I think it's also important to really talk about intersex conditions because a lot of times when these babies are born, they're subjected to what are considered corrective surgeries, but really, a lot of people consider that mutilation because it is a perfectly, oftentimes, and really 99.9% of the time, intersex folks are fine the way they are. They're healthy. There are, medications that can help. Surgeries are not necessary, but they're done a lot of times to babies because, parents really want to, quote unquote, normalize them and make them, they're worried about them being bullied or something like that. But it is something that should not be done, in my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of intersex activists. It's something that if the intersex person wants to have a surgery later on in life, then go for it, but not while, you're just a newborn and don't have a say in it. So long story short, that's a little bit about intersex. Please ask more in the Q&A if you have anything, and we'll get to it at the end. So now we get to gender, something that's very personal to us, and it's a way that we really see ourselves and show how we feel about ourselves. When we talk about gender identity, I usually tell people to envision a brain, because that's how we really identify ourselves, how we feel internally. And so for me, I am somebody who my gender identity is non-binary. And that means that for me, I don't see myself as strictly masculine or male or strictly feminine or female, just kind of somewhere in between. Like I said, 60% male, 40% female is the joke I usually say. And then gender expression, it's kind of pointing to that green dotted aura around that cute little unicorn. That's really just how we express our gender. That's just what we wear, what mannerisms we do. You notice I'm talking with my hands. That can be considered a part of my gender expression. My haircut, my shirt. I have nice sunflower florals on today. It can look very different for many people. And again, our understanding and lived experiences of gender are influenced by our cultures. So various cultures have different ways to really contextualize gender. So in the US, it's very different than somewhere else in the world. And I think that's important to note, especially with, if you are representing clients from various areas outside of the US. And now to get some of these terms, and again, there are going to be a lot of terms thrown at you today. So I encourage you to revisit this and think more about it and ask questions if you do, and I will answer those at the end. But and to use myself as an example, so because I was assigned female at birth, and I do not, female is not an identity that I have, that's not one I claim. Again, I fit more with non-binary or transgender. Really, that means because my gender identity and my sex assigned at birth don't align with each other, that means the term trans or transgender applies to me. I am a trans person based on definition. So on the opposite, if I, for example, if I did not transition, if I was assigned female at birth, and I continued, being female, and that's what felt right to me, then cis or cisgender would be a term that you could apply to me. That just means that your gender identity and sex assigned at birth are aligned with one another. It's just the opposite of transgender. That's it. There are also many different words like gender expansive. You might have heard gender non-conforming, gender creative. There are a lot of different terms for that. It really is a huge umbrella term to really just kind of put anyone who isn't, it can be, it's mostly non-cisgender people, but it also could be really anyone. That could be somebody who, for example, is a lesbian who likes other women, and maybe she doesn't, dress very feminine. Maybe she dresses very masculine, has short hair. She might consider herself gender expansive because she's not just in one of those boxes of, girls do this and that, boys do this and that. She kind of does whatever she wants, and that's cool. And again, non-binary is something where gender identity doesn't fit in with that kind of notion. And so there are a couple, again, so many terms. These are also acceptable terms on here. Gender queer, some people use. Gender fluid, meaning that, sometimes people, one day feel more feminine, and then maybe the next week they feel more masculine and kind of dress to fit where their identity feels on that day. And that's totally fine. And then there also is a term called agender for somebody who does not have a gender at all, does not use any kind of gender terms, strictly non-gendered, and that is agender. All right, and now if we get to sexual orientation here, this typically people have heard a little bit more about this and understand this a little bit more. But that's about who attraction, it's just simply put, and that can be sexually, physically, emotionally, romantically, spiritually, and more. And so the two that I kind of put out here are sexual orientation, who we are physically and sexually attracted to, and then romantic orientation is something that some people will also use to really be specific about who they are emotionally or romantically attracted to. So really, it's who you like, simply put. And so this kind of gets at some more of the acronym so that everyone kind of knows what all of that stands for. I'm not going to read through all of these because, again, I think that's boring and you can read through them at a later point. But I will point out bisexual and pansexual because they oftentimes are confused for one another and a little bit difficult to understand the difference. And so my best explanation of this is to talk about, first of all, the history of the word bisexual. It actually was it was a term that was coined to say it's someone who is attracted to more than two genders. It was actually meant to mean just attracted to different people. But because the prefix bi is in there, which means two, it eventually, obviously, inevitably got interpreted to mean attracted to men and women. And so it kind of fit the binary, which also has two in it. So it makes sense why people did not stick with the original definition. And so some people decided to claim the word bisexual and say, I like men and women, but I don't like trans people. I don't like trans men. I don't like trans women. And so they used it to exclude certain people in the community. And that's kind of where pansexual came up in all of this. And pansexual, pan kind of means across or spread throughout. It's somebody who's attracted to people regardless of gender. Gender doesn't matter, just attracted to people, really. A lot of people also use the term queer in the same way. I actually, if I were to give a term for my sexuality, I would probably use queer. And it's the same way that you would say pansexual. I'm just attracted to people. Gender isn't really a factor for me. It's more, I don't know, are you funny? Do you have the same interests as me? Things like that matter more to me. And because somebody asked about what terms are PC in one of the polls, I wanted to at least have a little bit of just this is not an extensive list. This is not the full list by any means, but I wanted to point out some things that are fine to use and then some things that you would want to avoid and explain a little bit about why. So first, I want to say the word transgender is an adjective. There have been many variations of the word trans that have kind of gotten muddled and confused, and you'll see some there. You might have seen transgenders with the S kind of making it a noun. It's just not correct because it's an adjective. So you'll see I put trans people, trans woman, trans man. They're not put together in the same word. They're separated because they're two separate words. Trans is the adjective, people, that is the noun, okay? The ED ending on transgendered, that used to be something we used back in, the 80s, 90s, probably early 2000s as well. We have strayed away from that and dropped the ED ending really at this point. So if you see it in past literature, it's no biggie. That's what was used at the time. We just don't use it now. My personal favorite, transgendering. Yes, I have heard some folks use that. It sounds so cool, almost like a transformer of some sort, but it is not. It's not a verb. So again, transgender is an adjective. You'll see I put some pronouns in parentheses after trans woman, trans man, and non-binary. That doesn't necessarily mean that every single trans woman is using she, her pronouns. That's just what is typically the case. And so I just wanted to give you some examples of that, especially when we talk about non-binary people. There are plenty of non-binary people who use any pronouns, he, him pronouns. Maybe some will use she, her. Maybe some will use multiple pronouns. Maybe some will say, I use both they, them, and he, him pronouns. So it completely varies. It's not just strictly they, them. Um, I'm not going to say in the to avoid the second bullet point, I'm not going to say that first word because that is a slur, but I wanted to write it out so that you knew what it was, what I was talking about. That is a word that's been used against trans people to, you know, really just bully and commit violence against them. So it's not a word I would use. There are some people in the trans community that reclaim that word and use it for themselves, which is more power to them, and they're happy to do that. I'm not one of those. I do not like that word. But I would not, if you're not trans, you're not in the community, I wouldn't use it. Transvestite, on the other hand, is also a word I would not use. There are some cultural places where it is used. If you watch Rocky Horror, sure, you can sing the song. It's fine in that case. It makes sense in that case. That was the word that was used at the time. We don't use it anymore. It's just kind of old language. And you'll see a little asterisk after that one, and also transsexual or homosexual. And that's because you know, sometimes non-English speaking folks might use these words to identify themselves because that's what's used in their native language. So they're not trying to be offensive by any means. That's just the direct translation of the word in their language. So that's an important point to note. And I will say that transsexual or homosexual are not necessarily bad words in themselves. So I don't want you to think that people can't use those words, because I know plenty of people use both those words to describe themselves and ask others to use that to describe them. And that's completely valid. So they're not bad words. I don't want you to take away that. But the reason why I put them in mostly to avoid is because there is a little bit of a complicated history when it comes to these terms in terms of the medical community. So homosexual and transsexual were used in the DSM. If you know a little bit about psychology, that is the book where you have many different mental health diagnoses in there. So depression, anxiety, etc. And transsexual and homosexual were in there in the beginning, basically calling them mental illness, and using it was used politically as a way to demonize trans and gay people, and say that there's just something wrong with them, like it's not normal, they should be subjected to conversion therapy, you know, to change them because this isn't natural. And so that because of that history, there are a lot of people who don't really like those words and would rather use transgender or gay or lesbian, or any other different words in the acronym instead, but they're not necessarily bad. Some people do want to use those, and it's fine for them. What's important in all of this is that you ask who you're talking to. You know, you make sure you know what their pronouns are. You make sure you know what name they like to go by, what words they use to describe themselves. Take note of that. That's what's most important, is making sure you are really talking to somebody and listening to them and using the language that they want you to use. We also kind of avoid saying any references to someone's lifestyle or sexual preferences, because that kind of has a connotation that they kind of choose to be, for example, gay. And that's just not the case. People don't choose that. It's just something that's there. And we try to avoid saying real name or real gender. Instead, you want to say something like birth name, sex assigned at birth, or maybe current legal name for legal documents. You could say that as well. Because the implication, even though you're trying to say what name you were born with, what name you originally had, the word real kind of makes it sound like the name that they now go by is just a fake name. It's not real at all. It's not valid. So that's why we kind of avoid that. But again, most important thing is really going what the person says they prefer. And I talked a little bit about pronouns, and you know, in English, we have pronouns are tied quite closely to gender. We do have a more neutral pronoun, they, them, theirs, which is typically used plurally, but I'd like to point out that we do use it in the singular form. It is accepted by the dictionary as a legitimate singular pronoun. so and it's also been used for many, many, many years. Shakespeare actually used they, them in the singular, if you go back and read some of his work. So this is not something that just came up recently, or, because I know it's been around more in the news recently as like almost like a trend, but it's not new. This is something that has been around for a while. It's just we've started being more open and out, and we have ways in which to, we have the internet, we have ways to really spread this information quickly. So that's probably why you see it more. And of course, you see a lot of different laws being fought for, et cetera. So that's why you see it. And so there's an example there. If you ever want to practice pronouns, I have different websites to do that. One on here that's listed, it says -18. It's actually hyperlinked in the PDF. You can choose any of the pronouns, and they have different ones too, even beyond the 3 that I just showed. There are what are called neo-pronouns that are also neutral pronouns that people have kind of created as a way to, kind of escape the binary a little bit more, and to, make terms that make more sense for them. So that's a great website that you can use to practice. I will say some people have said to me, I just don't know how to use they, them in the singular. And I would say you actually do it sometimes. You might not realize it. So for example, if you are, let's say you're walking down the street and you see a wallet on the ground that you found, and you pick it up and you look inside and there's money in there, a couple other random cards, but there's no ID. So you don't know who owns that. And so you go to a local, let's say a hotel that has a reception area and a registration desk. And so you go up to there and you say, hi, I just found this wallet outside of here, just right outside on the sidewalk. And I don't know who the owner is. They don't have their ID in here. So I don't know if they know that they lost it or if they're going to come back here, but I wanted to give it to somebody so that if they do come here, they can come and get it. That right there is an example of you using they, them pronouns in the singular. And I share that just because I think sometimes we don't realize we do it, but we do all the time. And again, it takes practice. If you mess up, all you got to do is correct yourself, quickly apologize. You don't have to draw it out and say, oh my God, I am the worst person ever. I'm so sorry I messed that up. Oh, I can't believe I did this to myself or did this to you. No. All you need to do is say, in this example, it says, he is, they are an awesome student. Sorry about that. I'm so glad to have them in my class. That's it. I don't expect everyone to get my pronouns right the first try around all the time. If I've known you for a while and you've known my pronouns for a very long time and you still don't get it right, then I might be a little bit upset and really hurt. But if you're just starting out with this, as long as I see that you are making an effort and you are correcting yourself when there's a mistake, then I'm completely fine with you messing up, as are many trans and non-binary people. Even for me, it took me a while to use my own pronouns for myself. It's an adjustment. You spend a long time, saying one set of pronouns to yourself. For me, it was over 2 decades of my life. She, her pronouns were used for me. And so it took a while of unlearning that and becoming more comfortable in my own skin to actually use the correct ones for myself in my head. And that doesn't mean that I am, not trans or that I'm a bad person or anything like that. It just means it takes practice. That's it. So it's not, it's not terrible to need to take some time to practice. What is the issue is if you just don't put the effort in, or really you just never really kind of do anything to get better with it. That's when it becomes an issue. But if you're making an effort, you're actually trying, you're getting better at it, that will mean a lot to me. And just so we kind of understand and start thinking about trans folks in particular a little bit more, understanding transition a little bit and what that looks like. it looks different for everyone. There's not a certain way you have to do it. Now, I think that sometimes we think there is, this way where you have to come out and then you gotta change your name and you gotta take hormones and, you gotta have these surgeries and all of this stuff. It doesn't have to be in that way. It doesn't have to be any of those. It's really whatever somebody is comfortable with and also what they have access to do. Because changing your IDs, some of those cost money and not everyone has the money to do that. And so there could be somebody who maybe they've been able to access hormones. And if you can't tell, hormones, testosterone did quite a bit for me in terms of my voice, my facial hair, all of that. Very powerful hormone. Maybe they have access to that and they do that, but they don't, because their health insurance covers it, but maybe they don't have the money to pay for updating their driver's license, for example. So it has their old name on it. All that really matters is that, trans people are entitled to the same dignity and respect, regardless of which transition steps they have taken, plan to take, or never take. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just however works, whatever works for you and whatever you have access to is what matters. And so again, getting to that point, IDs may not reflect identity. And so again, sometimes the social aspects of transition. So that means, changing the way you dress, changing your name socially and your pronouns socially, telling your friends, hey, can you use the name Ezra and they, them pronouns for me now? Maybe just doing those aspects of it rather than legal transition, which is court ordered, name change order, things like that. It might take some time before those are updated. So name changes require going to court, which can be a huge burden, especially for minors, especially for those who do not have supportive parents or guardians, and people with low incomes. A lot of places don't have there's no single process for changing your legal gender. It's complicated. I know for me, I'm originally from Pennsylvania. And for me, it was a huge process. So what is called the DMV or MVA, whatever you call it, the driver's license place, they had their own form to update my gender and my name. And then Social Security had their own requirements. They required a letter from my physician verifying who I am. Every single agency has a different thing they require. So it's incredibly stressful and confusing a lot of times for trans people to figure out, how am I supposed to change my name here? How much does it cost here? And so it's very difficult. And sometimes people will change one thing. Maybe they'll prioritize their driver's license and say, you know what, I don't even care about my birth certificate. I'm not changing that. Like it's too much. And I don't want to spend, $20 to do it. You are not bound by what's on the ID. There are ways that you could put in, whether it's in intake forms, if you are meeting with a trans or non-binary client, there are ways you can still honor who they are and say their name and the pronouns that they go by, and also collect the legal information because you need the legal information. You can do both. All right. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of information about discrimination, just some stats so that you can understand a little bit more about why this is important, both to me and to you, hopefully. Is that you'll see here a couple bullet points. So violence, almost 19% of all hate crimes reported in the US were based on sexual orientation. The number of hate crimes based upon sexual orientation has risen steadily every year since 2017. On top of that, you have issues with, when it comes to employment, many different issues. 27% of LGBTQ plus respondents said workplace discrimination based upon sexual orientation, and 7% lost a job as a result. And again, discrimination by police, I think we hear about that, police brutality a lot when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I say that because I want you to start thinking about how different identities kind of compound with one another and add to somebody's lived experience. And so 16% of LGBTQ respondents reported experiencing discrimination from police. This increased to 24% for LGBTQ people of color. So again, that is the importance of, we don't want to just see the person as just a trans person. There are many different identities that we all have, and they all play a role in how we're perceived, how we're treated, what we have access to, all of that. And it's really important that you take that all into consideration when you're thinking about what somebody is, requesting in terms of services, what they're going through, all of that. It's super important. And so this is just a little bit more just to kind of explain how trans people face discrimination that make it quite difficult many times to just basically live. You'll see, so there's one very big study. It's from 2015, so it's a little out of date now, but I believe they're trying to do another one. The pandemic kind of delayed that, so hopefully soon. But the National Center for Transgender Equality did a 2015 National Transgender Survey. It's the largest survey of trans respondents, lots of great information in there. And so we use it because it's the biggest and only national one for trans people that actually gives us a better, more comprehensive, if I can speak, view of what trans people are experiencing in the US. Over half of respondents reported hiding their gender identity or trans status at work to avoid discrimination. I know I have personally done that in the past. Many times. It has taken me years to get to a place where I feel comfortable and okay with, people feeling a certain way about me, or feeling, not believing that non-binary people are real, or whatever it is. It took a long time for me to be okay with it and to just be me. And if you don't accept it, okay, then we don't need to talk. If you do, great, let's have a conversation. Housing discrimination and homelessness is also a big deal. Accessing healthcare is incredibly a big issue, and unsupported family or friends is still a big issue, even though that's slowly getting better. It's still a big issue. I will say also, just to speak on my own experience, I, over the past 5 years, have had multiple bad experiences accessing healthcare. There have been times where I didn't go to the doctor when I should have because I just didn't want to deal with it. To give you one example, I went to an urgent care a couple years ago for what I thought was an ear infection. And so I went in and explained that and all the symptoms, and they were just kind of going through all the basics. And they got to the part where they asked me, what medications am I on? And I decided I wanted to be honest. And I told them that I take testosterone, and I told them all about the dose and what I do. And then it became a whole Q&A about me being trans. It all of a sudden, we weren't talking about why I came in there in the first place. It was, oh, well, what does that do for you? And, does this have anything to do with your symptoms today? And, just really invasive questions about what surgeries I've had. Again, not relevant to talk about for at an urgent care for an ear infection. But again, this is not just a me experience. This is something that 1/3 of people have dealt with something like this in their life. It's actually called, there's a term that we use for it. It's called the trans broken arm syndrome. That's when you go into the doctor for, a broken arm, but then it turns out we're going to talk about you being trans and not about why you came in here today. So again, kind of what I was alluding to already that I want to make sure people think about is that transphobia and violence against trans people compounds with discrimination because of a person's other identities as well. So when we're talking about race, national identity, religious background, that all adds another layer to this that needs to be taken into consideration. That's why it's super important to really talk to people on a case-by-case basis. Make sure you understand them and make sure that you are respecting them in the way that they're asking you to refer to them. And so there are currently very few rights codified in federal legislation. They've expanded rights a little bit over the past 25 years, but it's still not very explicit. So as of right now, there's no federal anti-discrimination statute that expressly includes sexual orientation or gender identity. The way there's a little workaround that has been an argument has been prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex or because of sex. There are three examples of that there: the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, Title IX of the Educational Amendments Act, and the Affordable Care Act. They all have sex discrimination located in there. And so the argument that has been made that because sexual orientation and gender identity is tied and linked in some way due to sex that is assigned at birth, therefore these legislations that this applies to those in the LGBTQ plus community. And that has been, there has been a decision in the Bostock decision that expanded that interpretation to include it. But again, the challenge with that is because it's not explicitly said sexual orientation and gender identity in the law, will that actually hold? I am under the opinion that I would rather have legislation be very explicit in what is covered. I would like it to actually say sexual orientation and gender identity. That way, there's no ambiguity. You know what is covered, rather than just relying on the basis of sex. And so it's a very big question mark on what's going to happen with that. And then you'll also see that some agency regulations and executive orders include sexual orientation and gender identity, but it's subject to change by each administration. So things have already changed a little bit since Biden became president, changed for the better. But again, that's something that every 4 years could change up. So it makes it very, can be very stressful sometimes. The good news is that 24 states, including Virginia, offer some state level protection. We still have a long way to go. I want to make sure we know that, but we're getting there. Okay. And this is a really great resource for you to kind of look at some point. And I will actually kind of take you out of this slide deck here for a moment and show you what this website is. So it's called Movement Advancement Project, or MAP. And they have a lot of different what they call equality maps on there. And it's just so you can kind of get an idea of what are the laws and policies in your state, and where do they kind of gauge your really your tolerance levels or your acceptance of LGBTQ plus people. And so you'll see Virginia's here. It's got some tallies on there, and they have an explanation on there. You can read like how they kind of come up with these tallies so that you can understand more of the basis around it. But as of right now, Virginia has an overall tally of medium, which actually isn't horrible. That's not too bad at all. And so if I actually take you out of this, and hopefully you can see me scrolling here. So this is the same page. And so you'll see some quick facts when you choose a state. You will come here to Virginia's equality profile, and let's say quick facts about Virginia. You'll see it has some links to where they're gathering some of this information. So you'll see what has been estimated based on these two data points is that 4% of the workforce in Virginia is in the LGBTQ plus community. You see about the population, et cetera. And then you see the overall, like the sum. And then you see right here, you can click view methodology and more information so you can understand how that's happening. And then if you keep going down, they actually break down the various laws. And this is updated quite frequently. So this should be very up to date. And so it'll explain if there is law or policy here, if there are some local laws or policies or partial laws, but not full coverage, or if there's none at all or not applicable. And so here you have stuff about parental recognition. And so you'll see family services, non-discrimination laws. There are not adoption non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ parents in Virginia right now. So you'll see the X. So, and then you can kind of go down and see state non-discrimination laws. This is a new change. It kind of explains here that the Supreme Court ruling in June 2020, people in all states can seek recourse for employment discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity through the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and federal courts. So you can see a little bit about that. There's so much more on here: LGBTQ plus youth laws and policies, healthcare, criminal justice. There's a ton of stuff. So really they kind of add all of this up, and that kind of equals the overall tally. You can also, if you'd like to see just in general, some of these, a snapshot of maps, if you click on Equality Map Snapshot, you can kind of see the entire US and the territories. So you'll see Virginia over here is in the medium. So by far not the worst, but also not the best. So you can see some of the red states, so Louisiana, Georgia, et cetera. You can see some of the quote unquote high overall policy states. So you'll see Maryland, for example, is closest to Virginia. You'll see California, et cetera. So you can kind of just get an idea of what is out there. You can see, if you click on California, you can see what actually makes them a high overall policy tally, so that you can kind of understand a little bit more of what laws and policies would bring up this ranking. What are the needs within the community in terms of state protections? So I highly encourage you to go to that and check that out at some point to learn more. All right, and just to talk a little bit about some experiences LGBTQ plus folks have in the courtroom. There is a survey done by Lambda Legal about the experiences of LGBTQ plus individuals in the courtroom. 19% of participants had heard a judge, attorney, or court personnel make negative comments about an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And again, making sure we're taking into context all of the different identities somebody has. Rates go significantly up when you consider other marginalized groups. So for example, 30% for queer people of color. And then you'll see others there. You'll see 66% of trans women particularly. 16% reported that their LGBTQ plus identity was raised in court when not relevant to the case at all. And so again, while I think that it's kind of, world has been getting a little bit better and more understanding in many ways, there's still a little bit to go when it comes to making sure clients feel respected. And so just so you understand what that kind of looks like if you're ever in the courtroom, and you want to know, what kind of to keep an eye out for. These are just some examples of what you can see in the courtroom. So it could be, again, focusing on gender identity or sexual orientation when it's not relevant at all. Not referring to them by the names that they go by, but instead referring to them by their legal name. For example, at my work at Free State Justice, when we created various petitions for name change orders, we actually had a little footnote that was in that petition that explained, like, this is this person's name of common use. It's not their legal name, but it's their name of common use. The reason we are using this is because this person is transgender, which means that, it's just a little snippet so that the judge and others who are, reading this document understand why the name and gender that you're referring to may not match with the IDs, the legal IDs. So that's just one example there. Putting the onus on LGBTQ plus individuals to explain why they're there or why their case matters, failing to take into consideration transgender defendants when maintaining single-sex dockets. There's a whole other issue that we could even talk about outside of the courtroom and talking about prisons, about where trans people are imprisoned when they get a sentence. It usually does not match with their gender identity. And there's a lot of issues that kind of come about with that. And then just really letting people get away with discriminatory conduct or inflammatory language. This is what happens. And so again, I'm not going to read that food for thought scenario just because I am long-winded and I talk a lot, but I will encourage you to download that in the handout section and look at it and really reflect on it at a later point, whether it's today, this weekend, or later on. I would really encourage you to do so if you're watching the recording of this, to do so. It really, so that just to kind of give you an idea of what this sample says, it basically is where somebody, I believe the name is Miss Angela Smith. She is a trans woman and she's going to the court to get a copy of her name change order. And so I think it's a phone call and, she kind of talks to a couple people who continuously call her Sir and Mr. Smith because they see her old name on the reports coming up on their database. And she also hears people laughing in the background and is just feeling like she's being made fun of and based on her gender identity. And so it kind of asks three different questions of, what could have been done differently? What if maybe even the court folks weren't even laughing at her? They were laughing at something else. How to really kind of go about that conversation in terms of, making it a better outcome where Miss Smith doesn't feel like, anyone's laughing at her, that instead, somebody messes up, they say, oh, apologies, Miss Smith, and moves on and continues to call her Miss Smith. So that's something I want to share with you, and it might sound a little silly, but that is something when I met with clients at Free State Justice, that had happened multiple times. It was not, this is based on multiple scenarios that have actually happened over the past few years. So please do think about it and think about how you would respond. And yeah, all right, just a couple more slides left before I will then look at the Q&A. So first of all, I just wanted to share some just very general best practices to keep in mind as you really start, thinking about if you represent a person in the LGBTQ plus community, or really just ever come in contact and want to know how to best support. The biggest and most important thing is making sure to treat somebody with respect and recognizing their inherent human dignity. And that sounds like such an obvious thing to say, but I find that it's not always obvious. And so it's important for me to say it. And especially because I think that, again, what comes along with that is that even if, for example, even if you do not think non-binary people are real, if you think it's it's just not something you agree with, it still means that you use that to respect the person. You don't necessarily, again, you don't have to agree with everything that I say or do or my life choices. I'm never asking you to do that. That's completely fine. You don't have to. But, for you, if you are somebody who maybe you go by your middle name instead of your first name. I actually have my niece. She goes by her middle name instead of her first name. So I call her middle name. It's no big deal. She told me that's the one she uses, so I use it. It's really that simple. Maybe I felt that, well, it's technically not your first name. Like, that's kind of weird that you're going by your middle name. I could feel a little weird about it and maybe not necessarily understand it, but that I'm still going to use it because that's what she asked me to do. And I love her and I respect her, and that's what I'm going to do. So I think that's why it's really important that I say that. Trainings like this and others are super important. I think honestly, that there cannot be enough of different trainings, not just virtually, but hopefully one day in person again. Maybe just somebody kind of observes a day-to-day and kind of gives feedback at the end of the day. Just making sure courthouse staff, attorneys, orgs, wherever you are trained and counseled is super important. Addressing explicit bias and disrespect immediately when it happens. Oftentimes what has happened to me is something like somebody will say something offensive to me, let's say, and there will be one of my friends there with me or a coworker, whoever it is, who would never say something like that to me, but they don't say anything right then when it happens. But later on in the day, they said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe so-and-so said that to you. I'm really sorry about that. I want you to know I'm here for you." That's great. But the fact that you didn't interrupt it when it was happening hurts a bit because people are not going to learn what is actually appropriate or what you actually, want them to call you unless you call it out right then and say, "Oh, actually, my name is Ezra. That's what I go by. I don't go by that other name. I appreciate it if you use it." Calling it out as you see it is incredibly important. You have to hold people accountable. And it's not saying that you blame people for making mistakes, because people make mistakes. I make mistakes. I am not perfect by any means. But it's just a way to, let's work together to make sure that we're respecting each other. If I said something inappropriate or wrong about somebody else, I want somebody to tell me that. I don't want to be calling you something you don't want to be called. I don't want to offend people. So as long as I know it, then I'll make sure to correct it. And so that's why it's important to really call it out, not out of, shaming them or talking about how much better you are because you don't make that mistake, but really just to educate, have empathy. It's okay to make mistakes again, but just it's really important to let them know what was wrong and what they said. Track what pronouns and names people want to use for every single case. This is possible. If it's not necessarily possible to track in your databases, I know again, in my old position, we added in a line in the intakes to, really make sure that people felt that we had a place to honor who they are. So again, name of common use was there, and then we had legal name. We had gender identity there. We had legal gender. So there were two different aspects. So again, we were able to collect the legal stuff we needed to collect, but we also collected the things to honor the client. Avoiding gendered language and honorifics when they're not necessary, or if you don't know what gendered language or honorifics somebody wants to use, like if you don't know if I use Mr. or if I use mix, which is MX, or if I don't use it at all, just avoid it. Kind of follow my lead, or you can simply ask. I think we always get afraid of asking others. And again, if you just do it in a respectful way and just say like, hey, I just wanted to check in with you to make sure that I'm addressing you the way you want to be addressed, is using Miss okay to address this email? If not, let me know what to use for you. It's not a weird thing. It feels weird because we're not used to doing it, but I promise you it means a lot more when you ask and then do it correctly than when you just kind of guess and then maybe you do it right, but maybe you do it wrong. So it's really important to be involved in that conversation, to respect them. And again, only inquire about gender identity or sexual orientation when relevant to the case. I think I said that many times, so I won't say that again. There you will see a list of different organizations. Most of them are national organizations, but they are all really great places for you to gather more information. A lot of these places do various surveys and studies and articles and just a ton of information. A couple that I'll point out is, first of all, Virginia, you have a statewide LGBTQ plus organization. It's called Equality Virginia. They're very active. I know quite a few of them there. They're very kind people. They're very much willing to assist if you have any type of legal questions or really just questions about the community. Please do reach out to them. If you're interested about intersex activists, Interact is a really great resource for you legal folks. You have GLAD, that is Legal Advocates and Defenders. There's also Lambda Legal. They're the national LGBTQ plus legal advocacy organization. There's also SAGE for LGBTQ plus elders. Et cetera, et cetera. UCLA School of Law, of course, the Williams Institute is also a great place. All right, so please do visit those. And I also want to say thank you to those who attended this. I know this is not a CLE session, so I knew it would not be many people, and that's completely fine with me. I like having a small group, to be honest with you. But I appreciate you all showing up to learn and to begin this conversation. I am always available if you want to kind of talk about this more. I am always open to really, having these conversations. Again, I am pretty much an open book. I love talking about this stuff. It's important to me. And so, yeah, there's my contact information. That's my work phone number. It also goes right to my cell phone, so I will get it. That is my VPLC email, which you probably have gotten emails from me on there. And that's also my personal email address on there if you ever want to reach out to ask additional questions. So at this point, I'm going to pull up on my phone. I'm going to pull up the Q&A in the chat to see what I covered. And I do remember I forgot to I forgot to address what the plus means in LGBTQ plus. I remember somebody asked about that. That really is there. Not everyone use it. Sometimes you'll see LGBTQ. Sometimes you'll see LGBTQ plus, LGBTQIA plus. The I stands for intersex. The A is for asexual or aromantic. And it's there's no like uniformly accepted way to do the acronym at this point in time. It kind of changes as we discover new terms and kind of adapt them into our language. But the reason I use LGBTQ plus is number one, it's a little bit shorter, more concise. And the plus really represents that there's more than just LGBTQ. The LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning, those aren't the only terms that exist, right? And so that's really what the plus is there for, just to let people know, like, this isn't all of it. There's way more to explore in the community. So I wanted to make sure to answer that. And I see somebody ask, when discussing an individual, is it they is or they are? It is they are. So let's use me as an example. So if somebody is talking about me, we would say, so Ezra is the training specialist at VPLC. They are working on organizing this conference. They have been working quite a bit over the past week, answering a lot of questions. And I heard that they are also having a great time. And that is all very true. And so that's the way you would use it. Now, in terms of saying how we would say like himself or herself, there's kind of a split on what people do here. So some people will say things like, Ezra's going to do it themselves. So using that kind of singular like ending. And some people will say Ezra will do it themselves. There's not really a formal like acceptance of what is the best way to do that. I think most people are leaning towards saying themselves. It's a little weird because we're not used to saying themselves, using they, them pronouns. But I think that is what more people prefer, is using themselves. For me personally, it doesn't really matter to me as long as you're using they, them. So thank you for that question. Okay, what can I do to help educate people who say listing pronouns is only a nonprofit fad and the business community will never accept this trend? And I see Sushila put an extra piggyback on this question. How do you address those who find pronouns to be limiting? That is a really great question. And I think that really, I think a lot of this is around education. And I think this has been something that has been common that I've seen and doing trainings like this in the past, is that a lot of times people are, don't really see the importance of it. But for me, let me explain why it's important to me. So when I see a place that has, I'll even give an example of VPLC when I applied to this place. So when I applied, I received an email from somebody on staff to, go through the interview process, right? And I noticed right away, the pronouns in the email signature. And as small as that is, and really not a big deal, in a lot of ways, that signaled to me that, okay, people here actually are, they might not know everything about the community, which is completely fine. I don't expect them to, but that shows to me that there is a level of respect that already exists for me, for the community. Again, it doesn't tell me everything about a person, but it tells me that there's at least an open door in terms of a conversation. There's at least, a very good chance that I can feel comfortable being here, that I can be who I am. I don't have to hide who I am. And so that is just one way that it is really important to have things like pronouns in there. And it also is kind of nice to have them in there because then you don't have to, if you don't want to, you don't really have to ask that, I think a lot of people get nervous about asking what somebody's pronouns are because, again, it's something we don't do a lot. We're not in practice of it. But it eliminates that if you don't like to necessarily have that conversation out loud all the time, even though I think you should practice it, it kind of gets rid of that question mark because you see it in the email signature and oh, all right, That's their pronouns. Got it. Now I don't have to speculate on that. I know it now. So that's just one answer I would say. And I see somebody said that I met someone at a conference who uses the pronoun Z. Yes, that is a neopronoun. I didn't talk about those. There are a bunch of different ones. They are they can be a little difficult to learn because there are so many of them. And again, we're not used to it in our day-to-day language. And so Z spelled Z-E, and then it usually has here and here's spelled H-I-R or H-I-R-S, here self. There's also Z-Zem, Zir. There are a bunch of them. That -18 website that I shared, I believe has a lot of those as well, if you're just curious to see what those look like. I would say a very small population use neopronouns, but it is really cool to practice and to, at least know of them, because you never know when you're going to meet somebody who uses them. And you know what? I was wondering if somebody would ask me about Dave Chappelle. I really did. And what do you know? Tony did it to me. Do I have any comment on the Dave Chappelle Netflix special and the resulting walkout? I don't. I will say, first of all, that I have not watched the special. I have seen a few different things about it. I understand why people are walking out. I understand. I really understand a lot of different sides to it, to be honest with you. I think that, I won't talk a lot about this because honestly, it's not too relevant to my life right now. But I will say that I think comedy is a very complicated genre of of entertainment that a lot of times depends on shock factor, and it also depends on saying things that are controversial. I think that's a part of what makes it provocative and interesting to people. So I don't think Dave Chappelle had any bad intentions behind that. I will say that. But I do think that some of the things that he has been quoted to say can and have been linked to harm against trans women in particular. So I do find them problematic, but I do think a lot of comedy is also problematic, if that makes sense. All right. Let me see if there are any other questions. You can post more if you'd like. I appreciate you saying this was a great session. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Glad you're learning a lot. Again, you can always reach out to me via email is probably the best way to reach me. Either one works. If you have additional questions, let me know. I'm happy to answer or have a coffee chat about this stuff. Again, it's something that I'm very passionate about. And so I'm always willing to answer, and I'm just going to check one last thing on the poll to see if I answered most of these things. And how do you stay up to date? Oh, yes, because I think that's a really good point, because these terms change a lot. I would say even when I first started doing these trainings years ago, the terminology has completely changed. I truly mean that. And so I would say almost yearly, there's something that changes in terms of terminology, or a better way to describe it. So that's a great question of where you can kind of keep up to date. There's this one resource that is called the Trans Language Primer. It is an online dictionary, essentially, that has every single sexual orientation and gender identity that you could ever imagine on there. And it's online, and they update it routinely, so that it has examples and all of that kind of information. That's like one big place I would go to if you're curious about a very specific term. I would also say a lot of the organizations that I listed on the previous slide that you can access, a lot of them have like your basic term sheets, and they update them routinely, especially the national organizations. For example, the Human Rights Campaign, I'm pretty sure they update their terms occasionally. And again, they usually kind of just focus on the basics and don't go into the nitty gritty. But that's a good baseline just to make sure, things are, your terminology is up to date. So that's one thing that I would recommend is taking a look at that list of organizations. We didn't really talk about the rights of LGBTQ plus children under 16 versus the right of parents. It's not because I don't want to talk about that. It's because there's too much to talk about in that. So I want to just acknowledge that that is a whole other beast in itself. It's quite complicated. It often varies state by state. It also depends on localities a lot of times as well, especially when we're talking about school systems. And parents and LGBTQ kids. So there's a lot that goes into that, and it's very messy. So I'm not going to talk about that now since it's already 10:15 anyway, but I appreciate you reaching out. One of the places to look about if you're curious about LGBTQ plus youth in general and schools especially, GLSEN is a great organization. It's spelled GLSEN. GLSEN, they are a national organization that has also local chapters in different states that works on supporting LGBTQ plus youth in K through 12 education specifically. And so they have a lot of resources around, kids' rights, all of that kind of stuff. So I would highly encourage you to look more there for some more information. And I'm going to check one more time to see if there is anything else. And again, I appreciate y'all asking these questions and for enjoying it and attending today. It really means a lot to me. So thank you so much for allowing me to present at the same conference that I've been organizing. I appreciate it. I hope you all have been enjoying this conference and going well. I know that there are going to be more sessions starting at about 10:45. That's going to be our last batch before closing remarks at noon. So be sure to check out one last session and then join us for the closing remarks. And then I can't believe it's already over. That happened very fast. So again, thank you. I hope you're all enjoying the conference. Go stretch, walk the dog, take a break, stretch, all of that. Said stretch again. I'm going to stretch multiple times. And I hope you enjoy and have a great morning. Hi, Sushila. Thank you for the thumbs up. All right. Almost done. All right. Take care, y'all.